So in this lecture, I'm going to argue that you should not fear death. Not that you shouldn't fear the painful process of dying, but rather if it could be painless, like dying anesthetized from a surgery, that would be irrational to fear. So first I'm going to argue that if you're not conscious after you die, then you should not fear death. Then I will actually argue that you are not conscious after you die. And finally, since you can't feel pain after you die, death is not bad for you. And if death isn't bad for you, then it's going to be irrational to fear it. The argument against fearing death. FD1, you cease being conscious when you die. FD2, if you cease being conscious when you die, then being dead is not bad for you. FD3, so being dead is not bad for you. FD4, if being dead is not bad for you, then you should not fear death. FD5, so you should not fear death. In the next segment, I'm going to break down FD2, and then I'll come back and defend FD1. Then finally, I'll actually defend FD4. Again, to be clear, there's a difference between the painful process of dying and actually being dead. The process of dying can be excruciatingly painful and so bad, but being dead is not painful. And since it's not painful, it cannot be bad for you. And since it's not bad for you, you shouldn't fear it, or it would be irrational to fear it. All right, so the support for HD2 is going to come from the principle of hedonism. This is the idea that pleasure is the only thing that's good for you and pain is the only thing that's bad for you. So here in this argument, painfulness is going to be understood in the broadest sense. It should include psychological and emotional pains as well as any physical pain or discomfort. So the appeal to hedonism might seem intuitive. Like, why is it bad for someone to kick you? Well, it's bad because it hurts. But also pain sometimes can be indirect. For instance, why do we brush our teeth? We brush our teeth to prevent plaque buildup. Why do we want to prevent plaque buildup? Because plaque is going to cause cavities. Why do we want to prevent cavities? Because cavities can cause us pain. So even if this is intuitive, we still should be very careful about how we're going to state the hedonistic principle here. So we can state it as HD, something is bad for you if and only if it is painful. So there seem to be some things that are bad for us even if they're not actually painful, like eating an entire pizza in one sitting. In contrast, there also seem to be some things that aren't bad for us, but they might actually be painful, like getting a deep tissue massage. Obviously, eating the pizza now isn't going to be painful, but in about an hour, you're probably going to have a huge stomachache. And about an hour after your deep tissue massage, your muscles are probably going to feel more relaxed than they were before. So this is going to suggest that something is good or bad for you in connection with future pleasures and pains. HD star, something is bad for you if and only if it results in more pain than you otherwise would have had. So this is still going to be true to the core principle of hedonism. Eating the pizza causes you pain that you otherwise wouldn't have had, and the massage is not bad for you because it eliminates pains that you otherwise would have had. Ultimately speaking, what is and isn't bad for you is still going to be based on what is and isn't painful, but now we're going to take future pains into account. Right now, here's our first chance to stop and reflect. Can you think of any counterexamples to the hedonist principle HD star? All right, now with HD star in mind, let's turn to the argument for FD2, the argument from hedonism. AH1, if you cease to be conscious when you die, then being dead does not result in more pain than you otherwise would have had. AH2, something is bad for you if and only if it results in more pain than you otherwise would have had. FD2, so if you cease being conscious when you die, then being dead is not bad for you. AH1 is trivially true. Pain is a conscious experience. If you're not conscious, then you're not going to be feeling pain. And so if you're not conscious when you're dead, then you also can't feel pain when you're dead. AH2 is our principle from hedonism from the previous segment, HD star. So this is where people tend to push back. They tend to push back on this premise here, AH2. And they tend to do so in the following three ways. So first, they might appeal to this medical condition known as congenital analgesia. So this is a rare medical condition where a patient can't feel pain. So at first, this might actually not sound so bad, but upon further reflection, it's actually quite difficult to live with. Without pain, they don't know when to pull their hands back when something is too hot, or they don't know when to go to the hospital when they have a broken bone or some sort of other internal injury. So it seems like this could be a counterexample to HD star. According to HD star, the condition cannot be bad for anyone who does not feel pain. Well, the condition cannot be bad for anyone with this condition because they can't feel pain. But rather, remember, we're not just talking about physical pains here. We're also talking about emotional pains, like the torment of having to live with severely burned hands because you didn't know to pull them back. All right, so second, one might object to HD star on the grounds that something can bring you lots of pleasure can still be bad to do. So for instance, let's consider this case, the case of the stolen cruise. Brendan is about to go on a week-long cruise, and his girlfriend Piper serves him undercooked chicken in hopes that he'll get food poisoning and will let her go in his place. Piper's plan succeeds, and she has a great time on the cruise. She comes back refreshed, relaxed, and feeling no remorse whatsoever. The idea is that what Piper did was not bad because it did not bring her a lot of unpleasant feelings. But that's not a problem for HD star. Notice that there's a difference between something being bad for you and something being bad to do. HD star is only concerned with something that's bad for you, and it doesn't say anything about what is bad to do. Since giving Brendan food poisoning was not painful for Piper, HD star does not say that it was bad for her. All right, so the third grounds that someone might object to HD star are not much of an objection, but rather more of a suggested modification to the principle. So instead of just focusing on pain, we can think about being deprived of good things in the future as also bad. So we would formalize the principle as HD double star. HD double star says something is bad for you if and only if it results in more pain or less pleasure than you otherwise would have had. In short, what is bad for you is what makes you worse off in terms of pleasure and pain. If HD double star here is true, then this could be trouble for the argument. When someone dies, then they're going to be deprived of future pleasures that they could have had, which means that HD double star entails that death is actually bad for you. However, HD double star is open to some counterexamples, like the case of unread mail. Carly meets Evan, and they immediately fall in love. Because things are going so well with Evan, Carly stops checking her online dating app. They have a long and entirely happy life together. It so happens that Jamie sent Carly a message shortly after Carly met Evan. If she hadn't met Evan, she would have seen Jamie's message, fallen in love with her, and she and Jamie would have had a long and happy life together. As a matter of fact, she would have been a little bit happier with Jamie than with Evan. The point is that Carly would have been in a slightly better off with a relationship with Jamie, then according to HD double star, even being with Evan is bad for her. But that definitely seems wrong. Being in a happy, loving relationship, even if it's not the most maximally loving relationship you possibly ever could have had, is still not going to be bad for her. So this is going to give us reasons to reject HD double star. So we can formalize this as the unread mail argument. UM1, Carly would have had more pleasure had she not met Evan. UM2, if Carly would have had more pleasure had she not met Evan, then if HD double star is true, then meeting Evan was bad for her. UM3, meeting Evan was not bad for her. UM4, so HD double star is false. So now we have reason to reject HD double star, but we still haven't found a good reason to reject HD star. All right, so remember that this is the argument from hedonism, and it's going to be in support of the second premise of the against fearing death argument. Right now, here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. If you were able to come up with a counterexample to HD star, could such an example give us reason to prefer HD double star? And also, do the hedonistic principles discussed in the last two segments imply that being born into this world was bad for you? Why or why not? If they do, can they be modified to avoid this implication? So again, what we were considering was the conditional premise. If you cease being conscious when you're dead, then being dead is not bad for you. But why think that you're not conscious after you're dead? In other words, why should we accept FD1 of the against fearing death argument? So some people may already accept that we're no longer conscious after we die, but other people might think that we go on to have some kind of afterlife. Or maybe you just think that we should be agnostic about what happens after death because all the people who've died, they're gone, and so we can't really know what that death experience is like. However, one could argue that we don't need to wait until death to find out if we're conscious or not. Instead, we can make an argument that we're not conscious after death right now. So the idea goes that first you should notice that right where you are, there is a living, breathing, flesh and blood human animal. For simplicity, let's just call this person animal. With that in mind, let's consider the following argument. Against post-mortem consciousness. PC1, if animal ceases to be conscious when you die and you are animal, then you cease being conscious when you die. PC2, animal ceases being conscious when you die. PC3, you are animal. FD1, so you cease being conscious when you die. So most people are going to find at least PC1 and PC2 here at least plausible. And PC3 is going to be a little bit more contentious, so I'll argue for that in the next segment. But for right now, let's just think about PC1. Remember, this is going to be a conditional statement. It is not saying that you are animal, nor is it saying that animal ceases to be conscious after death. Rather, it's saying that if both of those are true, then you cease being conscious after death. So PC1 is going to just suppose that you and animal are the same thing. Now, you and animal is just supposed to be two ways of referring to the same thing. So what is one of true is also going to be true of the other. So if animal stops being conscious when you die, and you are animal, then you stop being conscious when you die. All right, so let's set aside whether you stop being conscious when you die, and let's just focus on animal here. So after you die, animal will still be here on Earth, waiting to be buried or cremated or whatever. And you might be able to poke or prod animal, but you're not going to be able to stimulate any kind of brain activity. It's clear that animal stops being conscious after you die. Even if you think that there is an afterlife, you probably think that it's not going to be in this rotting corpse here on Earth. And you definitely don't think that that rotting corpse is having conscious experience. In other words, even if you think that there's an afterlife, you should still probably accept PC2. So you might think that you and animal are going to part ways after your death. You might think that animal stops being conscious after you're alive, but that you go on to continue to have a conscious afterlife. So you probably think that you and animal are two different things, and so you're probably going to reject PC3. But we can actually give an argument for PC3. And for this argument to be convincing, you actually need to be sitting alone in a chair. So especially if you have a cat or a puppy sitting on your lap, shoo them away for a minute and then think about this argument. So we have the too many thinkers argument. TT1, animal is in your chair and is thinking. TT2, you are the only thing in your chair that is thinking. PC3, so you are animal. All right, so we're going to go through this a premise at a time, but remember that TT1 and TT2 are going to entail PC3. So if you want to reject PC3, then you're going to have to reject TT1 or TT2. But they actually both seem quite plausible. So let's start with TT1. Surely your head is a part of your body, and your brain is inside of your head, and your brain is thinking right now. So it seems pretty undeniable that any animal with a fully functioning brain is thinking. So you might think, no, animal is not doing the thinking. Rather, maybe you think something like your soul is doing the thinking and animal is just merely a vessel for that. But I think you should be resisting this line of reasoning. So consider other animals. Surely they have brains that are thinking and they're going to have some thoughts. And so it'd be really strange to say that some animals are thinking, but that human animals are not thinking. All right, so then TT2. So TT2 says that you are the only thinking thing in your chair. To deny this would be to say that other than you sitting in your chair thinking right now, there's something else there. But that's absurd. So you might try and say that animal and you are thinking about different things at least. You are thinking about these abstract philosophic concepts, whereas animal is just thinking about bodily concerns. But that doesn't really make sense. When you think about abstract philosophic concepts, your brain is going to be in a particular state. And you and animal share a brain, and since animal's brain is in that particular state, it seems like animal is also thinking about those same philosophic thoughts. And so it would be absurd to say that two distinct things are sitting in your chair at the same time thinking about the same thoughts. All right, so since TT1 and TT2 both seem quite plausible, and they entail PC3, we should accept PC3. And again, if you want to reject PC3, then you're going to have to find some flaw with TT1 or TT2. All right, now here's another chance for us to stop and reflect. Are you convinced by the against post-mortem consciousness argument from the last two segments? In particular, are you convinced by the argument that you and animal are one and the same thing? So far, I've argued that death is not bad for you. We had our first premise that you cease being conscious after you die, which was supported by the too many thinkers argument. And then we had our second premise that if you cease being conscious after you die, then death is not bad for you. So this came from our hedonistic principle that the only thing that's bad for you is pain. And since you can't feel pain after death, death is not bad for you. But death not being bad for you is merely a sub-conclusion on our way to the ultimate conclusion, that you shouldn't fear death. And so for that, we're going to need one more premise here. So we're going to need a premise that's going to connect FD3 to FD5. Something that's going to be like, if death is not bad for you, then you should not fear it. So to see how this is going to work, we need to talk about what's the difference between a rational versus an irrational fear. So think about a tarantula. They might look really scary and, you might be afraid of them, but really they're not going to do much harm to you. They can bite you, but it's going to be about the same as a bee sting. And so still you might be terrified of them crawling up your arm. But this is an irrational fear. You should not be as afraid as you are towards the tarantula. It should be more proportionate, like you are towards the honeybee. So still, maybe this isn't completely irrational, but there are other fears that are completely irrational. For instance, ablutionophobia. This is the fear of bathing. But bathing isn't bad for you at all, and so this fear is completely irrational. Or Lepidoptera apophobia. I'm not quite sure. It's the Latin word for butterflies, and this is a fear of butterflies, which is obviously very irrational. Or podophobia, the fear of seeing someone's feet, even your own. All right, so what makes these fears irrational is that they are there's nothing that's actually going to be bad for you. And if death is really not bad for you, then we also shouldn't fear death. All right, so one might push back and say that it's unnatural to fear those things, but it's natural to have a fear of death ingrained in us. But that's missing the point of the argument. Surely it might be natural to fear death, but that doesn't mean that it's rational. For instance, there are a lot of things that we naturally think, but they're not natural. We see a lot of these now in the form of cognitive biases. So further, it's not clear that those fears are unnatural. It's completely natural to be afraid of spiders, but our natural excessive reaction to them is irrational. All right, so that's it. That's going to be the argument for death. It might be surprising to you, but surprising isn't always a bad result. After all, fear and pain are emotional states. And so if the argument can alleviate some of the pain, then maybe it's actually going to be good for you if you don't fear death. Right now, here's our last chance to stop and reflect. In the last segment, I suggested that it can never be rational to fear something that is not bad for you. Is that true? Can it be rational to fear something because it's bad for others? Do we fear death because and only because of how our death will affect other people?